Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all parties are on a listen-only mode until the question and answer segment at the end of today's conference, at which time you may press star one on your touch-tone phone to ask a question. I would also like to inform all parties that this call is being recorded. If you do have any objections, please disconnect at this time. I would now like to go in and turn today's call over to Ms. Karen Francis. Ma'am, you may begin.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. And welcome to the third webinar for the 2017 Rural Behavioral Health Webinar Series. Again, my name is Karen Francis, and I'm a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research and lead for the Rural Behavioral Health Initiative, along with my colleagues Joyce Sabian and Laura Fleetwood from the Mental Health Promotion Branch at SAMHSA. This webinar series is supported by the Mental Health Promotion Branch of SAMHSA in collaboration with the American Institutes for Research and Affirma Solutions. Again, thank you for joining us this afternoon for the webinar entitled Responding to Natural Disasters in Rural Communities, the Story of Two Communities. Our webinar today, we are pleased to have Desiree Lipka, a Disaster Coordinator, Solvista Health, Westcliffe, Colorado, and Marcy Vaughn, licensed psychologist and president and CEO of Seneca Health Services in Somerville, West Virginia. Today, we will learn about the efforts of two rural communities in Colorado and in West Virginia in responding to natural disasters. We'll also learn about the stages of disaster planning and response and identify strategies to address the needs of children, youth, and families who have been victims of natural disasters in rural communities. We will invite you to ask questions of the presenters at the end of the webinar this afternoon. You can ask questions to our presenters by typing your questions into the participant chat box that is located on the right-hand side of your computer screen. We will also try to respond to as many questions as our time permits this evening. Please note that this webinar, both the PowerPoint as well as the audio, will be posted on the Rural Behavioral Health web portal in about a week from now. And at the end of the webinar, I will provide you with the link for the Rural Behavioral Health web portal. Again, just a reminder, we ask that you mute your phones during the presentation so as to avoid any background noise as the presentation is given. Also, please do not put your phone on hold, or we will be able to hear the background music or messages that are recorded on your phone systems. So without further delay, I'd like to get us started just with a few polling questions. We want to learn about the participants joining us today for the call and where in the country are you located. So our first polling question asks, in what region of the U.S. is your community located? And please take a few minutes just to respond. Okay, and I see the calculating the polls. We're almost there. All right, so I see that, well, this afternoon, we're joined, the majority of the participants on our call this afternoon are from the west, northwest, or mountain states. And then some of our participants from northeast and the mid-Atlantic, from the good Midwest, and a number of participants also joining us from the south and southwest of the country. So thank you for that. And so now our second polling question is, what is your role in your program or your community? We'd love to be able to learn about the individuals who are part of these webinars and what role you play in your community. So if you just take a few minutes to respond to that. All right, so I see we have quite a number of our participants joining us this afternoon on management or administration. We have some clinicians and service providers with us, also some federal, state, as well as participants. And we have a number of individuals who have identified their roles as other, and we also do have some consumers that have joined us this afternoon. So again, welcome and thank you. And our final polling question for this today is, has your community experienced a natural disaster in the last 5 years? Please respond yes or no to that. Well, thank you. And again, we see that well over half of the participants on our call, this afternoon have experienced some type of natural disaster in their communities. Some, I don't know the answer. I would anticipate they probably have just arrived in their communities or haven't, lived there very long. So at this point in time, I'd like to turn the webinar over to our first presenter, Desiree Lipka. Again, she's a coordinator, the disaster coordinator in Westcliffe, Colorado. So Desiree, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Karen. I'm going to talk today about Westcliffe, Custer County, Colorado, but it also encompasses a little bit more of the central region of Colorado. Our latest disaster was a fire in Custer County. Custer County, Colorado's population is 4,000. It is a tourism and agricultural community. Many of the residents live out of state and come in for the summer only, and so there are many vacation homes and temporary residents. This is a map of the county, and the fire occurred. Can you see my pointer on the map?
Actually, we can't right now, Desiree.
Okay, so it is around the junction of 96 and 165 is where the majority of the fire was. So the date of origin was October 17th, 2016. It started at 3:45 in the morning. What had happened is that we had a severe windstorm on that night. It blew a tin roof off of a shed, which hit a power line, which went down and lit the grass on fire. It was located 11 miles east of the town of Westcliffe. The smoke was intense, as you can see from this photo, and that is near the fire. The smoke affected the neighboring communities significantly. Here's a picture of the airplane dropping the water on the fire near one of the residents. And keep in mind that this fire burned for quite a long time, and the smoke was thick for at least a week, but the fire actually did not go out until the first snowfall of the year. So one of the things that we discussed was having disaster preparedness in place really makes a difference when it comes to rural behavioral health disaster response. Our behavioral health agencies have been involved with our local healthcare coalitions, our local community crisis services such as meetings between fire, road and bridge, emergency management, sheriff's department, county commissioners, anybody in the area that might have and be called out as a first responder or to engage in a disaster response. We meet monthly, and we make sure that our disaster plans are up to date and that we are all know what our roles are. And that's really important for behavioral health because many times we are a forgotten entity. When people, first responders don't think of behavioral health immediately, so it's very important that we insert ourselves into those disaster emergency meetings. We were fortunate to be an active member of the Emergency Operations Center during the Junkins fire, and we were able to be on the front line with making decisions about how certain victim-related experiences were being dealt with. We staffed the evacuation phone line, so we were able to get people in contact with missing family members. We were able to have locations where everybody was sheltering. We were able to know if there were pets left on the property or animals of any kind. And then we coordinated, the behavioral health coordinator coordinated the Disaster Assistance Center, in which all the people that were able to came and checked in. And that's where they had to get badged in order to return to their property. That's where they could pick up supplies for cleanup with the Red Cross, Salvation Army, where they could get food, information on well water problems, tetanus shots from public health. That assistance center had all of those services available, and behavioral health was the lead on that. And that was a very, very positive role for behavioral health. And then we attended the community meetings where the law enforcement spoke, and also the members of the Forest Service, who was the incident commander at that time. And we had numerous community meetings on how to educate people on what was going on, how long the fire would be, when it would be contained, how long the people would be out of their homes, what they could expect when they returned. And then they had law enforcement taking people into the burn areas to see what had their property which had burned. And I believe we had 9 homes that were burned, and out of that 9 homes, 2 of those homes were permanent residents. The rest were secondary homes or vacation homes. One of the important things I believe that in a rural community that behavioral health does is support first responders. And I don't mean that we do therapy with first responders, but our role is to make sure that the first responders are taking care of themselves. I worked side by side with the sheriff for a good week, and I felt part of my role, and he has followed up with me since with appreciation, that I'm asking him, have you remembered to eat today? Have you been drinking enough fluids? Are you taking time out? Go sit in your truck for a minute and relax. Call your spouse, check in, do those kind of things. And I think behavioral health has a large role with that. We don't want to do therapy with first responders by any means, but we do want to make sure they're taking care of themselves. And we also want to promote resilience in not just the first responders, but also the survivors and victims of the disaster. We want to make them take care of as many things as they possibly can themselves, and not rely too much on external supports. We don't want to go in and fix things for them. We want them to be able to ask for help if they need it, but take care of it if they can. One of the couple things that were unique to rural behavioral health and the rural communities is most evacuees stay with family and friends. Few of the people in this area use shelters, and I've seen that with all of the disasters that I've been involved with in the rural communities. In the urban communities, they have a tendency to use the disaster shelters much more frequently. The other issue is that many rural people have pets, dogs, cats, and such, and the shelters generally won't allow pets, and so the people will not shelter without their pet. Another thing is that, we had a rancher lose 35 head of cattle in this fire, and that was disastrous for that rancher. That huge hunk of his living, how he makes his living, died in that fire. We also found we have a very fairly diverse population up here with temporary residents, permanent residents, ranchers. We have a fair amount of people that work remotely. We refer to .commers out here where so the politics are somewhat diverse. We have found that during the disaster, people in this community put those things aside. They come together, they provide food, they provide shelter, transportation. We have a whole system up here of large animal rescue where a team goes out and helps ranchers get their animals, mostly horses, goats, those kind of things, sheep, off their property. A lot of times they'll just let the cattle run free, assuming they'll get away from the fire. Lessons that we learned, I think the most important thing is that having those relationships develop prior to an emergency makes things run way smoother. If there's trust between your behavioral health team and your first responders, it makes things much smoother. If they know who you are, they've seen your face, they know whoever you bring on your team, they can trust because you've brought them, it makes a huge difference. Preparing the community, educating the community, the better we educate the community, the better the recovery is. And my disaster team that I work with in my communities, they are made up of a variety of people. They're not all clinicians. We have people that are in the billing office. We have people that are admin assistants, people in IT, people that are RNs, people that, do a variety of things in the agency. And so we don't rely solely on clinicians because we're not doing therapy. We're doing disaster response. And this is just one of the examples of one of the community meetings where we were educating the community on what was going on, how people were responding. The Forest Service did a wonderful job of bringing maps, showing people what to expect. And in the midst of all this, realizing, even though we were in a fire disaster, that because of that fire disaster, we had to immediately think about how that burn scar would be affected if we got rain in the spring. And sure enough, we've gotten rain, and we've had some flooding issues, but minimal, because we addressed that immediately with the community that was hardest hit by those fires. And so the flood damage was limited. And I think that's probably all I have.
Well, thank you so much, Desiree. And so we'll just move on now to Marcy Vaughn. And Marcy is a licensed psychologist and president, CEO of Seneca Health Services in Somerville, West Virginia. And Marcy will talk about the floods of West Virginia and the disaster response. So Marcy, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks for joining this afternoon's webinar. As Karen mentioned, I am the President CEO for Seneca Health Services. We're the behavioral health provider in West Virginia that serves 3 communities that were affected by our June 2016 floods. The National Weather Service described the event as historic and extremely rare. This week actually marks the anniversary of the flood, and the flood was a result of an estimated 7 inches of rain falling in a time period of about 3 hours. I'm going to share experiences from 3 communities in our catchment area. As you can see from the population statistics, they are extremely small towns, and they have very low household income averages. Rainelle is what used to be the heart of coal country and now struggles with high unemployment rates. The water rose very quickly in Rainelle, but it stayed for a long period of time. Rainelle is surrounded by mountains, so the mountains served the runoff from all the rain. The town served as a bowl. It lost hundreds of homes and businesses. Richwood was home to the timber industry and coal mining industry. Much like Rainelle, it had struggled over the past years with loss of employment opportunities. Richwood was affected in loss of their business district. What remained from the economic struggles were wiped out. They lost schools, grocery, pharmacy, and a nursing home, which was a major employer for the area. White Sulphur Springs is home to the Greenbrier Hotel. The town was actually preparing for a PGA event, the Greenbrier Classic, when the floods hit. The Greenbrier Classic was to be held the following week. White Sulphur isn't surrounded by any type of major water source, but a small creek became a raging river. The violent water knocked homes off of their foundations and carried them away along with their occupants. In all, West Virginia lost 23 lives during this event. When a natural disaster hits, it only takes minutes for your world to become chaos. The most important tip that I can offer is to be prepared, plan in advance. Seneca was fortunate in that the Bureau for Behavioral Health and Health Facilities, the West Virginia Behavioral Health Organization, had planned in advance and put together local teams with each of the comprehensive centers across the state. Those teams typically respond to fatal fires, unanticipated student deaths for high schools, mine disasters, and, of course, in this situation, the major flooding. Our local team, was able to be out in the communities as soon as it was safe for folks to travel, and they were prepared to stay there until outside help arrived. Our sister organizations, other behavioral health centers across the state, were in contact with us and prepared to send their teams in to relieve us if necessary. Disasters go through phases. The duration and intensity of the disaster affect just how long that interval will last. As a behavioral health provider, phase one is more about preparation. For us, what we saw was EMS and fire, rescue, law enforcement. They were extremely busy ensuring the safety of individuals during this time period. The behavioral health responses were very minimal because the focus was on search and rescue. Occasionally there was a need for some type of crisis intervention, but for the most part we spent these few hours actually preparing our response, the logistics of who was going to report where and when. Search and rescue, shelter setup, providing for a safe place, food, shelter were all important aspects of phase one that were handled. These are just pictures from the town of Raynell. This was actually the morning after. The flooding started in the evening hours, and actually if it had came during the night, we expect that there would have been many more lives lost. This picture is actually from Richwood that lost all of their business districts. Stage two of disasters brings an increased need for the behavioral health support. Survivors are still focused on meeting the food, clothing, and shelter needs, but they're beginning to think about the what now and how am I going to get through this. So it's very important for behavioral health to already be in place and observing folks for signs of difficulty in coping. An important part of this disaster had to do with the volume of entities that were affected. And in small towns where you have volunteer fire departments and many times volunteer emergency responders such as ambulance crews, these individuals not only had their organizations affected, but they were personally affected by the flooding, as were churches and church congregations. Those that may have typically responded to meet the need of their neighbor are dealing with this loss themselves. So our initial response came from our neighbors, our neighboring communities. It's during this time that you really don't have an organized response. Everything is rather impromptu. The photos above show some citizens from a neighboring town that brought in food to distribute to the victims. And then the lower photo actually shows a rafting company from a neighboring county unloading one of their rafts so that they could go and collect people from their homes that were stranded. This volunteer effort remains in place until the outside help can actually reach the disaster area. So as the organized response begins to arrive, this is a good opportunity for the behavioral health providers to kind of step back and hand things off to entities like FEMA and Red Cross. This actually allows providers to prepare for perhaps an influx of individuals who may be needing treatment or to rest, because as the organized response meets the immediate need and they start to pull out, they will hand those tasks back over to the local provider. We also see a lot of charity organizations that respond, like Mercy Chefs, Samaritan's Purse, the Appalachian Service Project, and so many others. And the arrival of charity organizations and corporate America actually is a symbol of hope for the survivors. They see these entities as an image of help, and it is extremely comforting for them. When I talk about unorganized response, I mean it only in the sense that it's not what they normally do. The charity organizations like Tides, Loads of Hope, and Mercy Chefs, that's their stated objective and goal, is to respond to communities in need. It's also during this phase that you may see introduction of the crisis counseling program. As you can see from this diagram, West Virginia actually put together a pro-West Virginia emergency response team. This is the team that is trained and prepared year-round by local behavioral health providers. The second emblem, the West Virginia Community Outreach Team, is that which was charged with the more long-term goals and objectives for meeting the needs of the disaster community. The reason that West Virginia chose to use pro-West Virginia rather than individual providers, emblems, and names is just to eliminate any type of stigma that might be associated with reaching out for mental health, or in the event that one of the disaster survivors had a negative experience with a provider, they wouldn't be hesitant to reach out for assistance. There is great importance in the branding message because, as you could see from previous photos, when you see individuals in the light-colored shirts, usually a bright color with logo, it separates you as part of the response team. Last but certainly not least, citizens respond. Folks show up from states and even countries away to assist in the midst of these disasters. And during the initial days after the flood, Raynell, for instance, which is where I was located, was like a small city. It had traffic jams. There were folks that were going up and down the streets. They had come from North Carolina, from Texas, with car haulers filled with bleach and brooms, and they would just knock on doors and hand out supplies and offer assistance. So private citizens, both locally and from afar, definitely are an important part of the response. Neighbors helping neighbors. During this phase, the crisis counseling program is established and teams are trained and take to the streets, shelters, and distribution centers, basically anywhere that they could anticipate a group of survivors. They provide information on where that they can access things or obtain assistance, the supply distribution centers, the disaster recovery center, which is set up from FEMA, the disaster distress helpline, and as Desiree mentioned, where they can receive emergency health care such as a tetanus vaccine or something for an urgent medical condition. And they can also talk a little bit about health education. As you know, many times when food is prepared for the masses, it's not exactly the best for someone who has heart disease or diabetes or a food allergy. So talking with folks about how to try to maintain a healthy status when they're surrounded with the not so healthy food choices. And also this is an opportunity for them to ask about medical equipment. You know, so often in floods, in this case flash flooding, there is no time to gather medications. There's no time to get the nebulizer or the diabetes monitoring equipment or medication. So by having the outreach workers in the settings with people, they can begin to ask these questions. Do you have a medical condition that you're typically treated for? Do you still have your medicine? Have you been able to contact your doctor for replacement medication? Do you have any equipment that you might need? One of the success stories that our CCP staff encountered, it was about 3 months after the flood, and they actually had encountered a survivor who had lost her nebulizer, and she obviously was struggling to breathe. And when they talked with her about it, she couldn't afford to replace it. She was a Medicare recipient, and she was going to have to pay for it and then be reimbursed. And they were actually able to link her to a group that had been set up to help with exactly those types of things, the replacement of equipment where payment was going to have to be made up front. The support techniques that are used during this phase are crisis counseling, the introduction of stress management skills, coping mechanisms, problem solving. It's during this phase that reality is setting in. They're tired, feel overwhelmed, and are not sure exactly how they're going to handle things. Your teams begin education efforts, looking to see if survivors are moving past the common reactions or if they're getting somewhat stuck with inaction or indecisiveness. Desiree mentioned the need to check in with first responders, and I'll add civic leaders. Our towns, being small towns, have mayors, and the mayors of those towns worked tirelessly in trying to take care of their citizens. First responders aren't done. They are still engaged in our situation. We had victims that had not been located. So they are a special group of survivors, not only because of what they see and do, but also because of how they deal with it. As Desiree said, it's important to check in with them with simple questions like, have you eaten? Have you rested? What did you have to eat today? Have you called home? Have you had a 15-minute break? They typically will do better when they're asked to share a story rather than answer a series of questions. In our event, our first responders were really struggling with the possibility that they might not find the last victim. She was a teenage girl who had been swept away in the violent waters, and they were staying in constant contact with the family. They had actually asked us as the behavioral health provider to come in and meet with the family and start to prepare them for that it possibly could be that she would never be retrieved. And I will never forget the evening that I got the phone call from the state trooper who simply said, "We found her. We've told her family." And the sense of relief that the first responder law enforcement community had with being able to return that little girl to her family. It's tip number 4, I guess, for me would be to ask to hear their story, as I mentioned, with first responders. This is a technique that was put into place by us not during the disaster but after, as we're doing some follow-up. Initially, we reached out to the fire departments and law enforcement entities and said, would you like to debrief? Would you like to have somebody come in and talk with your folks? And the answer was no, we're good. We've got our own people. So the team leader actually suggested, we're just going to come and we want to hear your story. We'd like for you to share your story with us. And that opened the dialogue where they could actually go in and sit down, and the members of the first responder community didn't feel like that they were doing this for themselves. They felt like they were doing it for our CCP team. And it provided the opportunity to educate on all of those same topics, the problem solving, the coping mechanisms, the stress management techniques, and was received very well by the first responder community. Do not underestimate the power of images. Just as the arrival of the organized response teams with the logos and bright colored T-shirts gave hope, whenever they start to sense that these organizations are pulling out, you'll see an increase in fear and anxiety. We participated in a morning briefing at the Raynell location, and the state police in charge started to talk about them moving their mobile command center out. It was week 2, they had fulfilled what they needed to with the command center, and it was time for it to leave. And the mayor of the town was visibly upset by it, and she explained she did not want her citizens to think that they were being abandoned. And so we talked about a way to transition, and the mobile command center was moved from where it was in the city center to the actual permanent state police location in that town. And it stayed there for a period of 3 to 4 days so that people saw that they still had the image of the mobile command center, but it was there, and the actual assistance that they were receiving came from the people inside the building. And that was a huge benefit for them as just reassurance that help had not left. They were still there. As you move into the long-term response, the focus, of course, turns to support, visibility, education. We did actually receive a CCP grant and found that support groups were a great mechanism to achieve some of the education and support criteria. Social media is huge when it comes to reaching individuals. During and immediately after the flood, our Behavioral Health Center's Facebook page lit up with just people looking for and sharing our posts about information and services that were available. So those are extremely important to use in addition to the traditional printed materials. Visibility. You'll notice this is part of our team. You'll notice that they have on the T-shirts, and we opted for vests rather than coats, even though we did go through the winter months, and very fortunately we had a mild winter, so that kind of paid off. By having that visual representation of the teams in their consistent logo embossed clothing provides the reassurance that help is still here. At this stage, we were starting to fall back from our door-to-door contacts. The teams had saturated and hit the communities that were affected, but they did still hear comments from folks that they were glad that help was still coming and that they took comfort in knowing that they had not been forgotten. Activities during this phase, as I mentioned, shift kind of away from the door-to-door and more to distribution of information, resource lists that happen at storefronts, craft shows, farmers markets. At the farmers markets, we were actually able to distribute information about soil repair for farming after floods. We were very fortunate that the schools, 4-H clubs, and Cub Scouts, Girl Scouts actually allowed our teams to go in and talk with the kids who were surviving the disaster and paired it with activities like painting birdhouses or flower pots that were then given to flood survivors. And while the kids were engaged in the activity, the team presented information to them about disaster preparedness and how to reduce anxiety whenever they had a rainstorm or felt a little anxious or nervous about weather. I think the most important tip is to train in advance. Be prepared. Desiree mentioned it. I mentioned it again here in talking about the foresight of our behavioral health organization at the state level who made that a priority. It was invaluable to be able to respond quickly until outside help could arrive. Have relationships and agreements with other disaster response organizations so that they know who to call. It's not a question. And be visible with hats or shirts or sweatshirts that actually identify you as mental health or behavioral health. We actually had that for our initial response, and it made it very easy for folks to pick us out. Go to the people. Seek them because they may not seek you. If there is a place where items are being distributed or food is being served, it's important to be in those places. And while there may not be any organized response, it gives you the opportunity to look at folks and see how they're coping. And if there is someone that's showing obvious signs of difficulty in dealing or coping, you can go up and engage them in a conversation. Use basic human compassion, be relaxed, lose any sense of formality. Folks like to be met at their level, and it's very important during this phase to be able to do that. And I guess probably the last tip that I would have if you're awarded a crisis counseling assistance and training program grant is to get a good team leader. We were fortunate to find a leader that had a passion for helping people. She was a member of a community that was affected, and it really brought the program to a high level of success. I think that's all that I have.
All right. Well, Marty, thank you so much for that presentation. At this point, we'd like to be able to open up the phone lines for any participants who have questions. And so I see that there is one question online. Now, we have a couple questions here, and then we'd like, then the operator could open up the or provide, participants with information as to how they can, have ask questions via phone. So, Marty, Desiree, the first question for you is, first our participant says, thank you, excellent presentation. Can you discuss the considerations you have for different developmental ages? And then I would imagine that it's considerations around how do you address the needs or, provide disaster response services and for, people within varying age groups across, the lifespan for children, for young adults, and for older members of communities.
This is Marcy. I would say that, as I mentioned in the presentation, the children we address through activities, something that they could be doing while a team member is actually working with them, providing them with information. We noticed with the elderly, they seem to participate in our group support sessions more, and they would be scheduled at a local library or a volunteer fire department in their community. They seem to be the ones that would actually reach out and participate in those activities. I envision that our massive distribution through our Facebook was from that age group that falls in between.
Oh, okay.
This is Desiree. I would just like to add that one of the things that I would encourage is peer-to-peer support and getting survivors that are more resilient to support and engage with other survivors of their same culture, and that I have found that to be really helpful.
Okay, thank you. And then we have another question. Here is, another question is, how do you manage approval? That, in other words, background checks for people who just show up to help?
We did not, as part of our team, we did not have any type of involvement from folks outside. Our team that was existing was our staff who had already had background checks and the required training. And then when we received the CCP grant, those individuals had to go through a background check as well. I do know that during our disaster, if folks showed up, they were asked to go to a specific place where they would register as a volunteer, but I know that there was no background checks that were being conducted at that point because the response was massive.
Okay. And then another
this is Desiree. All of our teams are background checked, and we have a Colorado volunteer mobilization. It keeps track of all the volunteers, and we also have a new badging system in Colorado called Salamander, and so you get a rapid tag when you show up to a disaster, and you only get a tag if you meet all that criteria, and it's logged in the Colorado Volunteer Mobilizer.
So Desiree, could you talk a little bit more about that badging process? Because I know that in your presentation, you talked about the badging. What exactly is it for those of us who've not, are not familiar with it?
Well, I have a trained disaster team that those names and those people get entered into the Colorado Volunteer Mobilization System. That system does a background check and vets all of my volunteers, and then they are issued a badge with their photo and data information on their badge. And so when we show up to a disaster site, we are automatically approved to enter that disaster. People know that we have had all the appropriate training and have been vetted as behavioral health volunteers. And then now, with those badges, we will also have a badge available per disaster that will be a certain color to allow us access to that specific response.
Okay, thank you.
Karen, this is Marcy. West Virginia has that same process for our trained disaster teams. We not only have the nice blue T-shirts, but we also get a badge that indicates that we have been trained in all of the required elements.
Okay, thank you. And then another question is, has the state of West Virginia now stockpiled supplies somewhere after lessons learned from these disasters?
Stockpiled supplies in the form of bleach, brooms, no. I imagine that most of what came through was distributed. I don't think that there would be anywhere to stockpile the amount that would be needed to deal with an event like this again.
Thank you. And then another question is, how do you take care of yourself so you can sustain this work and advise to others doing this work? So, Desiree, how do you take care of yourself with this work? And then, Marcy, I'd like to ask you the same question.
I'm a huge proponent of self-care. Whatever you do for self-care in your general life, whether you're a reader, whether you're a knitter, whether you're a runner, that you make sure that you keep those activities in your life during these stressful times. And to make, it's obvious to some, but increasing use of substances is generally not helpful. And we want to encourage people to not go that route. But making sure, if you always run in the morning, but you're in this disaster phase where you have, where you need to be at the disaster response center, make sure you get that run. Make sure that you do what you need to do for yourself so you can be there for other people.
Yeah.
And this is Marcy. The other thing that we did was to try to manage that for folks by making sure that there were shifts so that people had the opportunity to go home if they were able to, and encouraging them to take advantage of that break.
Same here.
Okay, thank you. So I just wanted to see if there anyone on the phone that would like to ask a live question at this point.
If you'd like to ask a question at this time, please press star, then 1, and record your first and last name. To withdraw your question, you may press star, then 2. Again, to ask a question, please press star, then 1, and record your first and last name. One moment for the first question, please.
Thank you.
I'm showing no questions at this time.
Okay, thank you, operator. So we have some more questions online here. The other question is, what are the signs that people need to step away or are overwhelmed and need support? What are some of those signs that you see?
Signs in the disaster team or in the survivors?
And I would say in both, with the disaster team, and then, in the survivors.
To piggyback on what Marcy said, I think it's a big role of the team leader to keep track of the staff and keep an eye on them, understanding what when they look stressed, appear stressed, you can feel their irritability, making sure that even if if they're supposed to be there for a 6-hour shift, it's only hour 5, but you can tell they're not doing so great, and to relieve them of their responsibilities at that time. I just really think that the team leader has a huge responsibility in that.
We look for physical signs, fatigue, fainting, blood pressure issues, headaches, cognitive issues like being confused or having nightmares. They're not able to make decisions, emotional, anxiety, irritability, and then behavioral like the withdrawal or loss of appetite, increased substance use, as Desiree mentioned. So looking across the spectrum at physical, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral symptoms that would suggest that either a survivor or clinician responding or a response person is experiencing.
Okay, thank you. So another question is, what are some examples of culturally appropriate supports that are provided in a disaster response situation? And these cultural response, what are the lessons learned in, when working with varying, with diverse populations in the communities that you are? And, what might you want to share with others about, how do you provide those types of services?
This is Desiree. I would say the one thing to be very aware of are languages spoken in your area and making sure that your printed materials address those languages and you just don't have everything in English if you have a diverse population like that.
We don't have a lot of diversity, especially with regard to language in our area. The one thing we did notice is with the elderly population, they were very hesitant to apply for financial assistance. And, for the most part, the loans, even low-interest loans, because in their mind they did not want to pass that debt on to their children and families. So, that was something that we had to take into consideration as you work with that population.
Okay. Thank you. So, earlier we'd asked the question about, what are some of the lessons learned, particularly around, stockpiling of resources, given lessons learned. So I think that, the question was, around issues around even durable medical equipment. Has there been any efforts, to ensure that, there are durable resources that, in place in the community, in the event that there is need for a response again? So not so much the soft, the perishables like the food and that, but more durable types of equipment and supports.
Our primary need initially was tetanus vaccines, and that was not an issue. The supply was there. It was just the massive effort to actually get folks vaccinated. And the area health providers, the county health departments did a really good job. They would load up in a side-by-side all-terrain vehicle and hit the streets offering the vaccine to folks. So that was the primary concern, of course, with our type of disaster, and it was met. There was ample supply.
Great, thank you. And so I just want to check, do we have any folks on the line who'd like to ask a question? And operator, if you could just remind of how we'd be able to do that, please.
Again, if you'd like to ask a question, please press star then 1 and record your first and last name. One moment, please.
So Marcy and Desiree, I have another question for you. What resources do you wish you had as you responded to these natural disasters that unfortunately occurred in your communities?
This is Marcy. The one item that would have been extremely helpful to us initially was a Go phone. It would provide a consistent number for whoever was in the field, a way to be contacted. So one of the things that we have done as follow-up is we will be maintaining Go phones in our office locations so that if we ever are dispatched, we have a consistent number. where not only we can reach the team that's out in the field, but also other members of the community disaster response team know this is my contact number for behavioral health disaster response.
And I would have to agree with Marcy that where breakdowns usually occur that I found is in communication somehow. We have radios that we can communicate with other disaster responders, but we've relied on cell phones within our team, and that's all fine and good if there's cell service. And emails are all fine and good if there's emails, but really having a more reliable communication system would be helpful.
Okay. Okay, so anyone on the phone with any questions?
Currently showing no questions.
Okay, well, thanks, operator. So, at this time, again, Marcy and Desiree, thank you so much for your presentation. I just want to take a few minutes to also share with our participants this afternoon some resources that are available from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration to support, states, territories, and tribes that, in their delivery of effective behavioral health services, as part of the response to disaster. So there is a SAMHSA Disaster Training and Technical Assistance Center, and on the screen here you will see, the contact information and website for DTAC. Also, there is a SAMHSA Disaster app, identifying the need for digital support during a natural disaster. So we also have the information on the screen as it relates to that SAMHSA Disaster app. And then we also have the SAMHSA Disaster Response or Disaster Distress Helpline, which is a national hotline. It includes a text. Services are available to anyone in the U.S. experiencing distress or other behavioral health concerns related to whether it be a disaster or anyone requiring help as they move forward on the path to recovery. And so we'd also invite you all to take a look at that, the information around that helpline, and we've provided also a lot of those resources on the screen. And then there are a number of other resources that are available as are presented here on the screen from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. So we definitely encourage you to, take a look at those resources and that material. And I just want to point out to everyone that all of these resources will be posted on the Rural Behavioral Health website within another week or so. And so I just want to take the time now to say again thank you to all of you who joined us for the webinar this afternoon, and I encourage you to join us for the upcoming webinar. It's going to be the fourth and final webinar in the 2017 Rural Behavioral Health Webinar Series, and this webinar is scheduled for August 16, 2017. It will be a focus on suicide prevention in rural communities. For additional information about this webinar and to register for the webinar, please visit the ruralbehavioralhealth.org website. And you can also get further information about resources for rural behavioral health on the website. Now, before we leave the webinar today, I just would ask that you take a few minutes to complete the feedback form using the link that currently occurs on your screen. We value your feedback and use the information gathered to enhance the webinars, this and as well as subsequent webinars. So if I would ask if you would take just a few minutes before we close the webinar to do the participant feedback form. So again, Desiree and Marcy, I just want to say a heartfelt thank you for sharing the information with us this afternoon and sharing, the stories of both of your